Okay, developers, we're going to start learning how to become software developers. And at the heart of being a software developer is working with variables. So we're going to talk about variables right now, probably for a real long time. What's going to seem weeks from now like, man, that was a really long conversation on variables. Variables, when we talk about declaring a variable, as a software developer, we're going to talk about declaring variables. That's just what we do, right? We don't really necessarily talk about creating them or defining them, although we might use that in conversation. In English, we're talking about creating and defining something. So we need to create something, we need to define something. In terms of variables, we talk about declaring them. And so declaring variables, I have three examples here. One, two, three. Three little examples on three different variable declarations. There's three different parts to the variable, declaring and assigning a variable to the variables. These are the three parts. So what's the first part? The first part we have to talk about is declaring a variable with one of the keywords that we have in JavaScript, which is going to be var, const, and let. There's a time and a place for using var, const, and let. Var is the first keyword that we used in JavaScript 101 days. A newer way of declaring variables for a specific place and time under not all circumstances is going to be const and let. For the time being, just so you don't have to worry about those other use cases, right? We're going to focus on var. Okay. So for the time being, don't worry about the const, don't worry about the let. Just know that there are examples like these lines here that allow us to declare a variable using the keyword const and the keyword let. We'll get to those in another video further down the road as we actually become more proficient in writing code. The next part about declaring variables is we need to assign a name. Okay, so here I have three names. The first name is message, the second name is permanent, and then the third name is greeting. So far, up until we get the keywords in the name is really important, not for the computer, but for the individual, right? For the human being. The human being, if I read this word message here, I can understand that this isn't a number like age. It's simply a message. It's probably going to be text that I'm going to want to show to someone, or I'm going to want to pass around into another system. So the names of the variables mean a tremendous amount. They're really important. It's really important. You can end up writing a lot of great code that if you named your variables and the objects in your program inappropriately, wrong, or just providing little context about what it is, then it doesn't add value and it makes the developer have to do more work, maybe more research into what is this variable actually holding? What does this variable actually mean? What's the value of the data that is associated with this variable? You could make someone spend a lot of time trying to figure out something really simple if you would have just named your variables correctly. Then finally, the third part here that we're going to work with is the assignment, the equal sign. So the equal sign in programming is an operator, right? And so there's going to be a family of different operators that we'll talk about later. The equal sign is the first operator to talk about, and it assigns value. So here we are assigning the value of hello world. That's the value. That's the data that we want to capture and we want to store that we are assigning to this value called message, to the name called message, to the variable called message. Okay? So the value that we want to assign goes on the right-hand side. Equals does the assignment. So here's this value. It is being assigned to the variable called permanent. Then next value, this is like a var, is being assigned to the variable named greeting. So equal means assignment, right? One equal means assignment. All lines in Java, all the statements in JavaScript, notice they end with the semicolon. You will see that in many, many things that you research on Stack Overflow or name your websites, the semicolon might be omitted. And it's not that it's wrong. It's just not required in every circumstance. The problem with not having it there is that every now and then, if you're not careful, it might lead to a bug. And so even though it's not required, good practice, especially for those of us that are learning to become software developers, is to always include the semicolon at the end of a statement, okay? Now, sometimes the statement's going to have multiple parts, and we'll review that shortly. But for right now, you can just think of, at the end of my line, put a semicolon, right? Not every line requires a semicolon, so this is right, not an exception to the rule, but things that make software hard. Like, when does that semicolon go there? If you're not sure, you could even just try putting the semicolon there and seeing if you get some feedback about that being the wrong place for a semicolon. But in the world of variables that we're going to live in here in the foundations course, you can safely assume that at the end of a line you can put in a semicolon. So one more time, we define when we say, hey, let's go declare a variable. We're going to use the keyword var. Then the next part is the name. What's the name for this variable? So usually when you go to create a variable, you're going to know why you need it, what you need it for, right? I need to store a message. I need to store my age. I need to store my address. I need to store the salary. I need to store my pet name. I need to store maybe a collection of strings, not just one string, but a collection of strings. Oh, that means I need an array. So maybe instead of calling, maybe I have a list of messages. So instead of message singular, I might call it messages because I want to signal that I have multiple messages in play. So we need the keyword one, right? So this is what we're talking about, the keywords. The next thing that we need is a name. So the name here is message. And so again, here's the list of names that I have in my examples. And then we need the value. Now, here the value does not include the double quotes. Let's talk about the double quotes. The double quotes for strings is what gives us our boundary. So the first double quote tells us, hey, I'm about to start a string. Let me get rid of this circle here. And let's point this out. So the first double quote says, hey, I'm about to start a string. The second double quote actually says, hey, I end right here. So the second string terminates it. It says the second double quote terminates it. The first double quote starts it. In JavaScript, under most circumstances, you can use the double quote and the single quote interchangeably, right? The only difference is that if you start with a double quote, the only important thing is if you start with a double quote, you got to end it with a double quote. But you could have declared this with a single quote and then you just end it with a single quote at the end. It's totally cool. Finally, again, the semicolon at the end. Semicolon at the end of the statement. So there is a lot going on in these simple variable declarations, but I wanted to show this to you before we start digging into the environment that we're going to work in, because the environment that we're going to work in, immediately we start having to write and discuss and demonstrate variables. So the variable is a keyword var, right? Later on, you're going to add to your utility belt, hey, I can use this as a const, which is constant, or I can use this as a let, okay? That's later on. For right now, just var. Picture var, use var. The next part is we're going to use a name. We're going to come up with a good, meaningful name. In the beginning, you're going to have two competing forces. You might want to start using very short variable names like X and Y, or M for message. Fight that, okay? I'd rather you err on the other side of being very verbose and saying that the message, instead of saying message, you might have called that hello world message. That's really verbose and too specific. Maybe you might want to call it my message, okay? But I would rather have you towards the extreme than towards the M and P and G, right? So if I was doing something terrible, I could have called this variable M, this one P, and this one G. That's not cool, right? Because if I look at these variables M, P, and G, that doesn't add value. I don't know what you're talking about. The full word message, okay, I can understand I can understand what that might mean. Permanent, I can understand that const is actually a way to define a variable that's not going to change, and hence why it's permanent to const. And greeting is just another variable name. So a var, name. In the case of a string, we're going to say double quotes. We're going to start the string. We're going to write it and then end it with double quotes. And so that's actually, this is a string literal. We have 3 examples of string literals where they are literally this string. Hello world does not change. This is like a var, right? So those are those variables. Now, this is important because in the next video, when I get you used to writing and talking about and the environment that we're going to work in, we write out some variables, and I want you to just be comfortable doing that. So as we progress into the next videos, I want you to be comfortable with that. A little bit more about variables, though, before we get out of here. And you could probably come back in here and watch this a little bit later on, especially this part here when I talk about variables being pointers. So again, our variable message that we declared over there, we named it message. So the important thing that I've tried to draw here is that message is this thing that lives in one space. And what it is, as this title indicates, is that it's a pointer. It's a pointer to a value that lives in this space here, this cloud that I've drawn here. This cloud that I've drawn here is intended to be the memory of your computer. So in the memory of your computer, there is this value. There's an address to it in the memory of your computer, the RAM. The variable serves to point to that specific value. And so that is why you will hear us, and why you're going to hear me throughout these videos. I will refer to them as pointers, right? The variable pointer. So the variable points to. What do I mean it points to? It's not that the value of hello world is over here in this area. It's not that. It's that the message literally is an object. There's a specific type of little tiny object that's a variable. And that name, message, points to the value hello world in the computer memory. So keep that in mind, because this is actually at the heart of the object graph tool that we're going to show you in the next video. The object graph tool, and one of the videos that that is going to follow, is going to help us visualize the importance of and how variables behave. Because the behavior of this arrow to a string is one particular behavior. But then if the value ends up being an object, or the value ends up being a number, this pointer and the relationship this pointer has to this object and that value changes significantly. This is an important topic to discuss ahead of time, so that you can visualize this and make note of the behavior in the graphing tool that we're going to show you. Okay, so variables are pointers because they point to values that are stored in the RAM of the computer. So with that, then we're going to jump over to another video, get used to the environment that we're going to work in, so that we can visualize all the variables, all the objects, all the numbers, the strings, the functions, everything that we do in a nice, nice to read illustrative graph that we've set up here in this course.